Welcome back. For those of you that have been participating all along in the summit. For those of you that just joined, welcome to the Stanford Neurodiversity Summit. Today is day 4. We still have 2 sessions to go today. This coming session is called Disparities, Diagnostic Disparities. And then after this is Mental Wellness in the Workplace. For those of you that do not know about the recording, the recordings will be in our website, our summit website. So please check our website for the YouTube videos. And there's also live stream in the same website. All questions from the audience will be submitted through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. The moderators will try to cover as many questions as possible. With this, I'm going to pass the mic to Marcy Schwartz and Callie Turk.
Hi, welcome everybody. I'm Dr. Marcy Schwartz, and I'm one of your moderators for this panel. I'm excited to be here. I have a private practice in Los Gatos, California, Thrive College Counseling, where I work with neurodiverse students find their path to college and navigate the college readiness piece through high school. I'm also an adjunct clinical associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences here at Stanford. My co-moderator today is Callie Turk, and she is a co-founder of REAL, which stands for Resilience and Engagement for Every Learner. Her organization works to support neurodivergent, twice exceptional learners by building bridges between the parents and teachers. We're glad to be with you all here today. I'm really looking forward to this panel. I think I might have said that already. But before we dive in, I want to introduce you to Helen Zhu, who's going to tell you about an exciting new initiative that's getting ready to launch soon. It's a K-12 special interest group. Hi, Helen.
Thank you so much, Marcy. So as part of our outreach to spread the neurodiversity movement to K-12 schools and students, the Stanford Neurodiversity Project is initiating the Network for K-12 Neurodiversity Education and Advocacy, or in short, NEA. This network seeks to foster a community for K-12 students, parents, and educators interested in neurodiversity to share and discover unique advocacy efforts, stories, and experiences. So monthly NEA meetings will feature students, parents, and/or educators from diverse backgrounds who want to speak about and discuss their experiences with neurodiversity or advocacy efforts and contribute to a larger network of neurodiversity education and advocacy across the globe. If you're interested in being added to our mailing list to receive more information for our monthly meetings, I will send out an interest form in the Q&A function very shortly. I will also attach a link to our website if anyone wants to read more about it. Feel free to spread the word or forward it to anyone who might be interested. Our first meeting will be on Thursday, November 19th from 4 to 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time with Sienna Castellan as our first guest speaker. If you sign up through the form, you will receive more details with the Zoom link closer to the date. If you have any questions, please email neurodiversity-nia@stanford.edu. I will make sure to add this email in the Q&A as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Helen. It's exciting. So we're going to just dive right in, and our first panelist is Stephanie Keeney Parks, and there she is. She's a doctoral student at the University of California, Los Angeles in the Department of Anthropology, where she studies medical, psychological, and linguistic anthropology. Stephanie's research centers on the everyday lives of Black parents who have children with autism. She is also interested in the process of diagnosing a Black child with autism, as well as the healthcare disparities that these families face. Stephanie is interested in centering the Black parent's narrative and experience as the expert to decenter white ideologies on health, healthcare, disability, and Black culture. Her research stems from her experiences as a Black woman, wife, and mother of 2 children. Stephanie's oldest child is diagnosed with autism. Stephanie, it is such a pleasure to have you here and to get our panel started. So I'm going to turn it over to you. Welcome.
Great, thank you so much for the introduction. I'm gonna attempt to share my screen and we'll see how this goes. Let's see here, here we go. I think you can see it. Wonderful, thank you for the thumbs up. All right, so again, thank you for inviting me into your space. I'm excited to be here and in conversation with you today. I am a doctoral student in the Department of Anthropology, and my work is directly informed by my own family's experience with autism. And it's what drives me to do the work that I do, which is working with Black families that have kids with autism, as explained, as well as spending a lot of time in clinics, watching how children are diagnosed and how clinicians interact with families who have children, or Black families in particular that have children with autism, and how graduate students are taught to think about disability, diagnostics, and working with families. So for today's presentation, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about language, actually a lot about language and culture, and very specifically the use of Black language, or what you may have previously been told it's called African American English vernacular, or even Ebonics. I'd like to make very clear that Black language has been extensively studied and understood by linguists to be grammatically complex, wonderfully creative, and every bit as equitable as standard English, or the form of English that white hegemonic cultural norms have deemed to be the ideal. So what I would like you to take away today, and what I hope you connect with as I'm speaking, is that race and disability often become conflated, or too often become conflated, and how powerful racism is with the best intentions, and that there is so much work to do to make clinical spaces equitable for Black people. So I'm going to start by giving you some insight into an ethnographic note that I have about a particular day at the clinic where the graduate students were spending their time learning how to administer the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, or the ADOS. I'll refer to it as the ADOS from here on forward. So the setting for this particular seminar is a large auditorium, and it's filled with 50+ graduate students, of which I am one, and I am one of 2 Black people in that audience. The clinician giving the test is a 50-year-old white man, and I'll call him Dr. Clark during this. The patient is an 11-year-old African-American little boy named Kevin. So we spend our morning in this clinic. I'm kind of combing through the ADOS and talking about how it works and what's important and what to note. When one of the graduate students raises their hand and asks, well, what if we run into culture? And Dr. Clark responds by saying, it's not about culture, it's about response. So I'm gonna leave you with this quote as we move through this talk. Just kind of think about that. It's not about culture, it's about response. Okay, so once Kevin arrives for his portion of the class, the live modeling of the ADOS, he gets a mic put on him, and the clinician comes in, and Dr. Clark is talking to Kevin, kind of getting to know him, and he asks Kevin, hey, Kevin, what do you like? And Kevin replies by saying, I like big butts and I cannot lie, which is, if you've raised a 10-year-old kid, you've probably run into a lot in his famous 1990s rap song, Baby Got Back, which is what the child is referring to. So the little boy is so excited by his new microphone that he's tapping on the microphone and hollering into it, woohoo, everybody can hear me. And he's running down to get onto the stage so he can take this test. But during the test, as many of you may be familiar with, the clinician takes out a book, and the book is a book with no words, and the intention behind it is to see if the child can form kind of a storyline that kind of makes sense, right? That's appropriately timed and has like a reoccurring theme and things that we would think of as typical, right? So this is where this kind of vignette sets us. And I'm gonna read you this transcript and you can follow along. I apologize in advance for my reading, but
Stephanie,
yeah?
this is Callie.
Hi.
Before we go further, do you know how to turn on the closed captions on your screen? Are you using?
Not.
Are you using Google Slides or PowerPoint?
PowerPoint.
So on PowerPoint, there's a place when you go back to the screen share where you can turn on closed captions, and someone has asked for them. And I don't want anyone to miss out on what you're saying because it's so great.
1 second, and let's see if I can figure out, is it under advanced or basic?
You might have to close out of screen sharing.
Okay, I apologize. We'll close out for 1 second.
Or you could screen share, but you might have to close out of presenting, I should say. I could walk you through it, but.
Okay, hang on.
Yeah, it should be under slideshow, and then there's always use subtitles is an option. And I'm sad they missed your big butt reference.
Do, but it's not letting me do what you're asking. So share computer sound or optimize screen for share video clip.
It's okay. We'll just go on without it for now.
Okay. All right. Man, I'm really sorry. Okay, so we'll start again where this clinician and the child pick up reading the book. So Dr. Clark says, hey, we've got something else to do, okay? Kevin replies, what is it? It wasn't me. It wasn't me. The clinician, okay. Kevin, what is it? Clinician, it's a book. We're gonna read a book together. Kevin, yep. Clinician, you know what's special about this book? Kevin, we have one last one. Clinician, you know what's special about this book? Kevin, Tuesday, Thursday. Clinician, it doesn't have a whole lot of words to it, so we have to make up our own story. Kevin, good, it doesn't have any words? Clinician, I'll tell you what, I will take a turn, then you can take a turn. Kevin, there are no words? Well, there's a couple of words. Let's see, let's start from, let's see about the frog. Kevin starts singing indistinguishably, and the clinician is kind of indistinguishably giving instructions, possibly something like, you hold the book. And he starts by saying, Tuesday evening around 8 o'clock, the sun is going down. To which Kevin starts singing, it's going down for real. And the audience starts laughing. And the clinician laughs, are you gonna sing this whole book to me? Now, Kevin's use of Black language in the form of singing It's Going Down for Real is another popular 2000 rap song, right? And during the scoring of the ADOS, Dr. Clark explicitly refers to Kevin's use of these rap lyrics as non-normative, disruptive, and echolalic. See, the problem that I see with this is that for Black people, there's very specific linguistic norms, one of which is called conversational sampling, wherein dropping lyrics and other popular phrases into our everyday dialogue is something pretty typical. And I'm gonna show you a famous example of this so you can have some context. So you may be, you may be familiar.
And then to know that Reverend Al Green was here. So in love.
Okay, so if you came like over to my house, say like on Sunday night and it's a family dinner and all of our families around, you'd hear a ton of conversational sampling and Kevin would be expected to participate, right? But what too often happens for Black families in clinics is they come under what we would call the white clinical gaze, right? Where things like Black behavior and Black cultural norms become conflated with disability, right? Termed as things like echolalic, they're non-normative. But how are they non-normative becomes like the real question. We have to be alert also to the fact that Dr. Clark terms Kevin's behavior not just as echolalic, but as problematic, right? As disruptive, as inappropriate. And he's doing that in front of a room full of future clinicians. The power of this can't go understated. When we're teaching a room full of future clinicians that Blackness and Black culture are deviant, we see the outcomes of this in public health data that show the astounding healthcare disparities for Black people. So I'm gonna bring us back to the clinic. and think about who gets to be Black in clinical spaces, right? So again, I'm gonna do another transcript, and please just follow along and give me a little grace as I read this. So Dr. Clark, what's your favorite class at school? Kevin, dancing and music. Dr. Clark, whoa, 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 your favorite class is dancing? Kevin, yeah, dancing and music. Clinician, whoa, 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 dancing. Kevin, yes. Clinician, you dance? Kevin, we dance and music all the time. Clinician, what do you dance? Like what kind of dance? Kevin, Alabama gal in music. Clinician, what? He tells us to find partners. Clinician, oh, what kind of dance do you do? Kevin, Gamma in music. Clinician, Gamma, what's that? Kevin, like when we dance by the hurry, just like we did last year. Clinician, using a Black scent. I'm one of the best hip hop dancers you ever seen. He laughs and he mimics dropping a mic. So I'm gonna take a second and play for you the song that Kevin is referencing, because I think this is important. Okay. You can see this is clearly not a hip hop song, and it doesn't require hip hop dancing. But okay. So what we're seeing here is a situation where Dr. Clark is doing his very best to try and understand what Kevin's telling him. Dr. Clark's working really hard actually to kind of make a relationship and going back and forth and clarifying and wondering, what is Alabama Girl and what is this child trying to get me to understand? But when Dr. Clark can't quite figure that out, he does the one thing he tells his students not to do. He leans directly into culture, going so far as to use a Black scent and embodying tropes of Blackness, like the images of hip hop dancing and dropping the mic, right? Stereotypes of what Black people might do or ways that Black people might be. Now, I want to remind you very clearly that Dr. Clark did indeed score this child's language use and his own Black language use, the Black child's Black language use, as being non-normative, right? Okay. So I'm going to talk to you for a quick second about what it looks like to be a parent in a clinic during a diagnosis. So in another observation, 2 families entered the clinic for our diagnostic day, like every Tuesday, the families come and spend a whole day going through this process. And on this particular day, there was 1 Black family, 1 white family, about the same socioeconomic level, both had kids around the same age. When the clinicians went into the Black family's room, the Black parent expressed that they had given their child a whooping because the child climbed on top of the refrigerator and scared the hell out of her, and she didn't know how to keep them safe. The clinician's reaction to this was to start questioning the parent. How often are you beating your child? How hard are you beating them? Are you using something to hit them with, right? And as the clinician exited the room, they met with the other people on the team, and they began questioning if the parent was unfit and if they indeed needed to involve Child Protective Services. Now, directly after this, they entered the second room. And in the second room, there's a white family, and the white child says, "Hey, when my mom is mad, she uses her shoe to spank me." And the clinician's reaction to this particular family was that the mother was emotionally unavailable and in need of support services such as respite care so she could get some time to herself and be able to parent the child more effectively. So we have to ask questions like, why is this? Why is it that a Black and a white family using the same disciplinary measures, whether we disagree or agree with those disciplinary measures, have terribly different outcomes from the clinician within the space of the same appointment, right? From one room to the next, and completely different outcomes. So one of the things that happens when I talk about my research is I'm often asked, like, what do we do about this? How do we stop this? Because I find that by and large, people care very much to make sure that healthcare disparities are not happening, right? And they'll often ask, you know, can we just add more Black doctors? Will this help the problem? To which I'm going to argue that is a beautifully well-intentioned answer, and absolutely we need to add more Black doctors. However, the problem's much deeper than this, and just adding Black people to your space is not getting at the root of the issue. And so I'm going to tell you a very quick story about a Black PhD student in psychology completing his clinical hours for his internship. And this Black grad student had been assigned to work with a young Black child. And during that appointment, the graduate student code switched into Black language to provide culturally salient care for this child. Unfortunately, the student's advisor was watching the interaction and pulled him aside at the end of the appointment and said that his language was unprofessional, and stated that if he behaved like that again with another patient, she would write him up. So, in conclusion, I want you to kind of really think about the juxtaposition of what it is that makes a white male physician, Dr. Clark, pretend to be Black, all while scoring Kevin's use of Black language as deviant, and the Black PhD student engaging with the young Black patient in our own language as being inappropriate and worthy of being written up. Or how a Black mom can't use the same disciplinary measures as a white mom without fear of child protective services or adverse actions where the white mom would get support services. Right? So we have to be hyper vigilant that given the white public space and the clinical gaze, that Blackness is often looked at as non-normative. And there are several reasons for this, including a long history of racism and racist ideology about Black language in particular, and the use of that language as being deviant. And this is underscored by long-held assumptions about Blackness and Black people being less capable and less intelligent. We have to counter tropes that are often passed around clinics, such as Black people don't trust healthcare, or Black people don't understand autism, etc., and start taking a very uncomfortably close look at the racism created and maintained in these clinical spaces. And I think it's really important to make explicitly clear that I have never in my personal experience as a mother of a child with autism, nor in my professional research, encountered a clinician that wanted to provide anything but the very best moral and appropriate services for their patient. But with that in mind, how is it that racism is continuously reproduced and maintained in this space? It is manifest in healthcare inequities that span the entire history of this nation. And racism is arguably most powerful when it happens in spite of the best intentions. And it's so much easier to defeat when it's obvious and open, done by people that we can see doing terrible things. But what we're fighting in the clinic is something very different. We're fighting against racism in quiet spaces, perpetrated by the very best of people with the very best of intentions. And wanting to diversify is certainly admirable. It's definitely a first step, right? But I want to gently remind you that there's so much more work to do than placing Black bodies into white spaces. You have to critically engage with the way that racism is happening, big, small, quiet, and loud in your space. And you have to do the work, the really hard, uncomfortable, terrible work that it takes to reimagine a place where somebody can speak in Black language in an ADOS or to a patient, or behave in ways that are culturally salient without the expectation to assimilate into white understandings of the world. So it's not just about being a clinic or a clinical space that has Black doctors and welcomes Black people. It's about being in a clinical space that allows for different cultural ways of being as equitable ways of being. Okay, I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was really interesting and powerful and very enlightening. I really appreciate that. Can't wait for us to all be able to talk at all the different pieces through. But for now, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Rita Obeid, who's received her PhD in psychology from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Prior to joining Case Western Reserve University, Dr. Obeid was a visiting assistant professor at Lehman College at CUNY. Dr. Obeid's research has examined predictors influencing language difficulties in school-age children. She is also interested in research examining factors that predict stigma toward people with disabilities, both in the United States and across cultures. Really looking forward to hearing you speak, Dr. Obeid, and welcome.
Thank you so much. Just a little closed captioning issue. I'm sending Callie my slides real quick.
Yes, I think if I run them, I seem to have the feature that allows closed captioning, but it doesn't seem that Stephanie or Rita have that. And there are people who would really love it, and we hate to leave anyone out. So we're going to try, and if we can't make it happen swiftly or easily, we will just keep moving.
Oh, so Dr. Lawrence is saying that no need to use closed captioning.
Yeah. It's up to you. I don't seem to. Why don't you feel more comfortable with your slides? Why don't you do them? But like I said, if you show them to me before if you go in and you go into the PowerPoint before you click on a slideshow, we can see if the button is there.
Oh, how do I show you? I haven't clicked.
Oh, you have to use Google Chrome apparently. Okay.
I am in Google Chrome.
Okay. Well, we probably want to just keep moving with your all's great presentations. I've let everyone know how apologetic we are and that the transcripts will be available. So people can go back and watch the video with the transcript.
Okay, so hopefully you guys can see my screen.
I just want to let you know before we get started how much I appreciate that you want to be inclusive, and we'll just keep moving.
Okay, I turned on closed captioning in Zoom. I don't know if that's going to work, but we'll see. First, Stephanie, that was such a good talk, and it was really, really informative for me. So I enjoyed that. My talk is going to be a little different. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the research that I've done on stigma and implicit biases, but hopefully we have like a same theme that we can keep discussing later. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A. Hey everyone, my name is Rita Obeid, and I'm going to be talking about diagnostic disparities in autism spectrum disorder. But before we talk about that, probably everyone knows what disparities are, but just to reduce the jargon, disparities are differences in access to resources, and these differences are based on demographic and sociocultural variables. And just starting off, we know that early diagnosis is important. We know that early diagnosis is important for so many reasons, mainly because autistic children or delays in diagnosis lead to delays in services and delays in accommodations. But it's really not only that. Listening to the narratives and speaking with people who have been diagnosed as autistic later on in life, we see how this is a hard process, and at the end it is a very freeing and positive process for them. And this is why thinking about early diagnosis is quite important. This leads us to think about when people don't get the diagnosis that they need. The literature shows well-documented differences and disparities in access to diagnostic and early intervention services. And these differences are really well documented among minority groups, economically disadvantaged children and families, and also girls, because the typical stereotype for an autistic person is a white boy. And so this is where we see these differences. Part of the story is this stereotypical representation. We see these differences across cultures, not just in the US. We see that ethnic minorities are less likely to be diagnosed with autism. They're diagnosed later and then misdiagnosed with other conditions, such as conduct disorder. And we're going to see that in the next slide. But what we're seeing here is among minorities, There are missed, delayed, and confused diagnoses. So in this study from Mendel in 2007, basically what this chart is really showing is these are kids who were supposed to have a diagnosis of autism, but that was the primary diagnosis that they got: ADHD, conduct, adjustment, cognitive, or other. I want you to focus in on this one right here specifically. This is where we see a big gap. We see that Black children are getting diagnosed with conduct disorder more commonly than white kids or kids who identify as other. Not sure what the other means in this Mendel study, but it's different groups. So let's think about some factors that are associated with these racial and ethnic differences that we see in the diagnoses. So we see socioeconomic differences, differences in the access to information and healthcare. We see cultural differences in knowledge and stigma and access to resources. And then we see biases. And I'm going to focus a little bit on cultural differences and stigma. And I'm going to talk about biases in general before shifting on to, well, what can we do as professionals, as educators? So personally, I've always been interested in studying stigma. I grew up in Lebanon, and I realized I was interested in stigma early on, just growing up in a very religiously diverse country. And then I started realizing as I went to what autism was. That was when my interests kind of shifted into autism and how little resources were available and how just generally high the stigma was from anything that was seen as atypical, whatever that atypical was, that diverged from what the majority population's perceptions are. So I moved to New York, and with my colleagues and mentors, we wanted to look at stigma towards autism across cultural contexts. And we all know what stigma is. We know that stigma is there. We've seen stigma in our lives and we've experienced it, but it's very hard to quantify and study. And one way to study stigma is to ask participants, right? And there are some limitations there, and I'm going to talk about that. But the one way we wanted to study stigma is using a social distance scale, which has been used in the literature since the 60s. You give participants a vignette or a story of someone. In this case, the story was of an autistic college student. And then you ask them how much they want to interact with that person to varying degrees of closeness. Do you take a class with that person? Would you be that person's neighbor? Would you date? Would you marry that person, etc.? And so we asked participants, and then higher scores here basically signify higher stigma. And just looking at the pretest, we see that the US did show stigma, but lower stigma compared to Lebanon and studies that my colleagues did in Japan. And then we did a knowledge online intervention. We talked about neurodiversity and what autism is. And then we did a post-test, and we saw that stigma was a little lower, although it was still there. So some limitations with looking at this type of what I'm going to call explicit bias or explicit stigma is that, well, participants are just telling us what they want to tell us, right? There are other types of biases that we might want to look at. And researchers have been interested in implicit biases, which are these biases that we hold, like even the best people with the best intentions, as Stephanie said, hold certain biases and behave in certain ways. And researchers tend to think that these implicit biases might play a role in the behaviors and the decision-making that we do. And these implicit biases, one thing that I want to say, are biases that are perceived as something that we are unaware of, right? As opposed to things that we are aware of and we are willing to discuss right here. So I'm going to bring you back to this chart a little bit. And if you remember this this difference here that was maybe surprising, but this big gap between Black kids being identified with conduct disorder when the diagnosis should have been autism. This led my colleagues and I to do the study to examine implicit or unconscious biases among participants. Our participants were college students here, so we wanted to see what kind of implicit associations they might hold. I'm not gonna go, ooh, I didn't mean to do that. I meant to do this. I'm not gonna go into too much detail about how this experiment was set up. All I'm going to say is, in the literature, people look at implicit biases using a task that's called the implicit associations task. And all this task is looking at is the strength of different associations that we make. So we wanted to see if we showed participants pictures of a white kid, or if we showed participants pictures of a Black kid, and then we gave them the terms autism and we gave them the terms conduct disorder next to these different words, African American and European American, what would participants associate with more? And what we found out was that these college students were more likely, so it depended on their own group. So participants who identified as Black were more likely to associate the Black kid in the pictures with autism and the white kid with conduct disorder. We saw an opposite trend where white participants were more likely to associate the white kid with autism and the Black kid with conduct disorder. So the question is, what can we really do about that? And how would that really affect our practice, whatever it is that we do, whether we're educators, whether we're clinicians, whether we're working with kids? What can we really do about these implicit biases or the stigma that plays a role? One way would be to diversify clinics and diversify organizations, but that is not just the only way. One way is also to educate ourselves and become more humble and become more, self-reflecting people. And so I'm going to introduce this concept called cultural humility. This is not a new concept. It was coined in 1998 by two MDs who really wanted to shift over from the idea of people wanting to be culturally competent and learning about different cultures, because just meeting one person who's from the Middle East basically is just meeting one person from the Middle East, right? Meeting one person who's autistic is just knowing one person who's autistic. So we want to shift from this view of mastering what a culture is to really learning where our limitations are. So before I talk about cultural humility and what we can do, there are so many different things that affect our cultures and our cultural identity. Some of these things are visible. You can think about your own cultural identity. And some of these things might be invisible, right? So if I were to think about myself, I feel like my ethnicity is more invisible, right? Until I meet someone and they ask me and they're like, oh, well, you don't look like you're not from here, right? I talked to my friend and I asked her, and for her, her ethnicity feels more invisible, her age, her disability, right? She's a neurodivergent person. So just thinking about how these many different identities interact with one another and how having visible versus invisible identities affect our disparities, affect how people interact with us, affect biases, whether they're implicit or explicit, brings us to what we can do as individuals. And this is basically my last slide that I want to reflect on. I just want to say that cultural humility is not just on the individual level. There's a whole piece that is on what we can do in terms of structural change, but I'm not going to talk about that because I believe Sarah is going to talk about this next, and she is the expert there. But as a person, as a clinician, as an instructor, for me, some things to think about is, what is my cultural identity? Can you guys hear that too? Second.
Yes, I hear that too.
Okay.
I don't hear it when you're muted, Rita. But you need to unmute now because I can't hear you at all.
Now. Can you hear me now? Ooh. Hello?
Yes, you're all good. We can hear you.
Oh, okay. Oh, I don't know where that came from. Okay, so where was I? So just thinking about the critical self-reflection that happens. I'm an academic, I'm an instructor, just thinking about how my interactions with students, how my own cultural identity impacts my interactions, how my cultural identity shapes my worldviews, just like something so silly and so shallow is that when I moved here, I used to watch shows and people would like punch into the wall. And I'm like, how did they break the wall and not their hand? And it's like as silly as like, I grew up in a country where walls are made of brick everywhere. And then just thinking that this is how it is in the entire world, right? This is just such a little example to show how we can tend to see the world from our own perspective and very rarely step out and try to look through someone else's lens. And the only way to look through someone else's lens is to really listen to them. How does my own background help or hinder my connections to people? What are my initial reactions when I meet someone who's culturally different? As a developmental psychologist, sometimes we hear about culturally different practices in terms of raising kids. And like the first thing someone would say is like, oh no, right? But like if you stop and think, like just different is not a deficit, right? How do I value my clients and my students in this power differential thing that plays a role? And how do I make space in my job for my colleagues and clients to speak freely and to talk about their own identities? So just this is the last slide that I really think is a take-home message from all like the implicit and explicit stigma that we talk about. And just a thank you and a quick shout out to my colleagues and collaborators, and some of them are here. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really great and very thoughtful. I want to spend more time on that last slide because I think that there's so much there for us to all take with us and maybe come back to that. I almost want to take a picture of it. So thank you for that. And we'll be hearing more back from you within the panel, but now we're going to go to Dr. Sarah Vinson, who's a triple board certified physician who specializes in adult, child, and adolescent and forensic psychiatry. She's an associate clinical professor of psychiatry and pediatrics at Morehouse School of Medicine, where she is the creator and rotation director of Psychiatry Mini Rotation for Pediatric Interns. She's the co-editor of two texts, Social Injustice and Mental Health, and Pediatric Mental Health and Primary Care Providers, and has written book chapters on the social determinants of children's mental health, child trauma, social media, and children's mental health and fostering resilience. We're really pleased to have you here as well, Dr. Vincent. I look forward to your talk. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here and just really appreciate the comments of my fellow panelists. As a child psychiatry program director, I'm always thinking about people who can come teach my fellows, and I'll be calling on both of them at some point because I think what they share is really important for diagnosticians to be aware of and understand. And so I'll be talking about diagnostic inequities and thinking about cultural and structural considerations when it comes to those. And so often, as Rita talked about, there's a lot to culture that can't just be summed up with race. And when it comes to white people, generally there is more of an appreciation for the fact that there is diversity within that group. They aren't painted in this broad brush the way that minority groups are. You don't have diversity days where they're talking about cultural competency, where somebody gets up and gives an hour-long talk on white people, because we don't, one, we think that white is sort of like the norm, so we don't need to talk about it. And two, nobody would try to put all white people in a box the way that this happens with minority groups. And so this is just an example, but this happens with Asian Americans, it happens with Latinx people, but just by way of example, we'll think about an African American male. And just as a Black physician who goes around talking about racism, I often get asked to talk about sort of Black stuff. One of the things that we have to lead with is that there is not a universal Black experience. And so to take this by way of example, if we think about an 8-year-old African-American male, whatever that brings up for you, if you start there, there may be things that come to mind for you, but what if I say an 8-year-old African-American male in Chicago's inner city? Or an 8-year-old African-American male in Maryland's Prince George's County, which is a county with a very large, Black middle upper class population. Or if I say a Black male in the Mississippi Delta. And I would posit that a lot of that child's experience, a lot of their culture, a lot of what's going to be very relevant for them diagnostically has to do with where they are and their socioeconomic status and the sort of norms that are around them that have a racial component, but it's not entirely defined by that. And that's a trap that we fall into, not just within medicine, in the broader society too, but the implications for medicine and psychology can be quite significant because we have this power of diagnosing people. And so, as Rita mentioned, there's so much more than race that comes with culture. And with competency, there's the implication that there's an endpoint. And when it's focused on race, it misses really important pieces. Whereas with humility, there is two-way learning. With competency, there's this idea that you go and you do X amount of hours and you do your CME or your CEU and you can check off that you went to the cultural competency talk. But with humility, there's acknowledging that there is diversity within different groups, and there's acknowledging that the expertise doesn't necessarily lie with the people we traditionally think of as experts based on their education or their training or the letters after their name, but that the expertise actually lies in the person, in the family, in the community. And so with cultural humility, there's a two-way learning process. It's not hire an expert to come in and talk about this group of people. It is sitting with your patient, sitting with that family and learning from them about what is important and what is salient. Another really important thing to think about when you hear things framed as cultural issues is to step back and question, is this cultural or is it structural? There are a lot of things in our society that are sort of placed in the marginalized or disenfranchised group that are actually broader societal issues. And there are ways that sometimes people's behaviors are responses to oppression that make sense in that context, but those behaviors might be pathologized or pinned to a group of people as a characteristic of that group of people, when it's really a characteristic of that group of people responding to the oppression of the larger society. And so asking, is this cultural or is it structural? And so earlier, Stephanie mentioned the sort of narrative around Black people not trusting clinicians. Well, that could be sort of like the cultural narrative that often is attached to how we think about this. But the structural question would be, what is it that our healthcare system has done? What is it that our mental system has done that has communicated to Black families that the system is actually not trustworthy? And there are a long list of things that the system has done and continues to do that communicate it's not trustworthy. It's not accessible. Treatment is inequitable. People don't have the same outcomes. People don't get the same evidence-based care. And so rather than saying this group of people does this, asking how this group of people's experiences in the broader society are different because of the racism that's existing in the broader society, and questioning the systems that are drivers. And then another question is this a disparity or is it an inequity? And so there's this way in medicine and mental health that we often talk about disparities, and disparity just means there's a difference. But when you're talking about inequity, you're acknowledging that there is a system or structure, that there is intentional design that is resulting in these differences. And so we're not just throwing up our hands and saying, oh, golly gee, I'm not sure why that's the case. But we're saying there are not as many clinics in this neighborhood compared to this one. When we look at availability of Medicaid providers, if the people on Medicaid are mostly white, there's more. And if they're not mostly white, there's fewer. That is inequity. And I would challenge you that whenever you hear disparity, you look for, think about, question what the inequity is, because it is almost always there. But there's a way that using that disparity language gives you an out, right? Because if you don't identify that there's a choice that we're making as a society that's driving it, then you can sort of throw up your hands and say, that's unfortunate. Whereas if it's an inequity, there's something that you can identify that needs to be addressed, or that could be addressed. The other thing that's important to keep in mind is that people of color in this country are more likely to have experienced trauma. And this, of course, includes racial trauma, but other types of trauma as well. And trauma, for those of you who may have some experience in the medical space, in medical school, they talk about how lupus is the diagnosis that can show up any kind of way because the body attacks itself, essentially. And I really see trauma as the lupus of mental health, that it really can do anything in terms of thoughts, feelings, and behavior, things that can seem quite contradictory. And so the presence of trauma in minority communities, even apart from the racial trauma, which is its own significant consideration, is one that has to be kept in mind. And something else we have to think about is structural trauma, right? So what Stephanie so beautifully illustrated is structural trauma by the mental health care system, when people are coming to a system asking for help, and rather than being met with understanding and that help, they're facing the racism that is part of the broader society. And so something else that is sort of a language issue is using the word racism. We often fall back on saying bias because it sounds a little less threatening, and good people can be biased, but bad people are racist. So bias is a bit safer, or can feel safer, but sometimes we need to call things racism. And if we use the definition from the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and we're really talking about racism as a policy, a procedure that produces different results along racial lines. And so I like that definition because it doesn't attribute malice or negative intentions to individual people, but it's just saying if you have an outcome that is different along race, it's racist. And when we're talking about our systems and the implications of our diagnoses, we have racism. It's not just bias. And we see this happening at the preschool level, that Black boys starting in preschool are more likely to face harsh disciplinary procedures. So you can say that it's bias, maybe perhaps on the part of the teachers, but when we know this and we're still doing it and there's nothing being done to correct it, that is racism. And part of that bias is driven by racist media coverage, racist education. And one of the things that drives diagnostic errors is people's premature closure. So if I'm primed to think of Black boys as bad, ODD and conduct disorder go along with that conceptualization of who Black boys are. And so once I have a diagnosis that fits what I already think, I stop looking for things that could indicate that they have a diagnosis like autism. And so diagnosis always happens in the context of family and families are always living in the context of society. And it's also really important to think about the culture of medicine and the culture of mental health, and that it's this very hierarchical culture, that it's one that prioritizes numbers and checkboxes. And there are ways that can miss things and fail to put things in context. And that erasure of context is one of the things that we see as an instrument of oppression, because the default context is the one that the people in charge have. So if you're not part of that group, you're more likely to have that erasure of context work in a way that doesn't capture sort of your experience. And so again, we can see this in other groups, but often we have more data when it comes to Black children in certain instances. And there's a way that society thinks of Black children as older, less innocent. Behaviors by Black children are more likely to be criminalized. And it's not just about diagnosis. That's really important. Treatment, it's not just about treatment, even though that's really important. When you're talking about particularly Black and brown children, educational failure has more of an impact on their life trajectories. And so it's not just about whether they're getting the services in school, it's whether this is putting them on a path to be gainfully employed or to be part of that overrepresentation in the criminal legal system. So the school to prison pipeline is a really significant consideration there. And also thinking about communities where people are. And there are millions, literally millions of children in this country who are in schools with school resource officers, i.e. school police, that don't have a single nurse, school psychologist, or therapist. So when what you have is an agent of the criminal justice system, but not an agent of the mental health care system, what is used to respond to behavior or respond to deviance is often a criminal punitive response rather than a supportive educational response. So our system is one, when we're thinking about structural issues, that is very disjointed. It's generous to call it a system, quite frankly, and is driven by inequity. And as I mentioned, there's this culture of medicine and mental health that is very top down. And as Stephanie mentioned, just having more Black providers isn't enough, because if you train those Black providers the same way everybody else is trained, they're going to end up replicating those things. And then when it comes to diagnostic hurdles, there are ways that the bias of clinicians definitely comes into play, whether it is affinity bias, where they relate more to people who are like them, and so they look for explanations for problem behavior, confirmation bias, where they're looking for things that already support how they think. But there's also in medicine and in mental health, this drive to diagnose the individual and to place the pathology in an individual. And there's less of an appreciation for context in the broader society. And there's also this emphasis on label, but I would encourage anyone who's a diagnostician, who's a clinician, who's a family member, to really think about the formulation, because the label only tells you so much, whereas that formulation is going to put those things in a biopsychosocial structural context. And that's where you figure out what's actually helpful to people and what's actually going to get a family through. There are some kids I have who have a label of ADHD who aren't treated with medication at all because the formulation doesn't call for that. And so really putting the emphasis there rather than on diagnoses. And so what now? Self-study is incredibly important. You should know about disparities, inequities in the communities that you are working in and the communities that your patients are coming from. Using family support and health as a guiding principle, and being really intentional about being anti-racist. So if the numbers show there are different results in your clinic, in your hospital, in your mental health system, then that is a racist system. So making sure that you're counting and trying to do things to address the inequities that are there and continuing to count so that you can adjust in real time. And that is all I have.
Thank you very much. I was very compelled through the whole time. I think when you forget the time is passing, it was really great and engaging. And I have so much to say or questions to ask. So I'm going to throw it over to Callie, who's going to get us started on some questions, and I might jump in with some of my own.
Yes, I'm like you. I came up with several questions of my own as I was going through, but I think what we really wanted to do for the first few minutes was see how you all responded to each other and questions you might have for each other, or thoughts that each other had that provoked your own thinking or furthered your own thinking about this topic. So before we turn to anyone else's questions, we're going to let you have a chance to talk to each other about your observations and thoughts.
I was in listening to Stephanie's talk, I was really curious about where you've been able to share your work and the types of receptions you've had to it.
So this is a difficult question, right? I think you know that because I'm pretty sure you're sharing your work in the same spaces, especially now. That it can be quite a minefield to talk about whiteness this openly, and to like unmark it, right? Like, because we think about, and I think Sarah was doing the same thing, talking about like how we leave whiteness unmarked as like this normative way of being that's just this background. And we're asked to talk about the Black people things, right? Not the white people things, because we don't consider, and there's even like this whole literature on like how folks don't consider their own culture a culture, which is very strange, because it's definitely a culture. It's like its own unique thing, right? So it's been interesting. I have done a lot of work with clinicians lately. I find that certain types of clinicians are a little more amenable to the things that I'm saying, like occupational therapists are a little easier, speech pathologists are a little easier, anthropologists, they get it. That's a little, because we view everything culturally, it's not a hard sell to say, hey, a subjective test that's based on somebody's ability to speak or behave in a certain way is going to be racialized is not news. But for some folks, that's news, right? I don't know. Sarah, I was thinking about yours too. And like, when you were talking about like this, the system, and then you were like, okay, so it moves into the school. And I often like end up talking about schools as well, because disability, as you know, like doesn't stay in one place. Like it doesn't just happen in this silo called the clinic, it moves. And yeah, like, okay, so we move police out of schools, which is like an amazing first step. Yes, do that. Guess what's gonna happen with your social workers and your nurses and they're gonna pathologize, they're gonna criminalize, they're gonna do the same thing. And so it's gonna take a different route, maybe. Like they're gonna have to call the police to come to the school, but it's still, we have to do deeper work. And I think that's what we're all like trying to set in front of you, is that the work is so much deeper than this surface level thing. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because as someone who's in the criminal justice space, it's really interesting to hear them talk about, well, if the mental health system is intercept zero and we catch them before they get to criminal justice, then we'll fix racism in criminal justice. And I'm like, nope, guys. We have some work to do in the mental health system first. So I think there's more potential if there's mental health professionals there, because at least they have some therapeutic tools and some training around development and interventions and things like that in a way that SROs don't. But you're absolutely right that it's not just enough to switch. Like, this is an issue that permeates every system.
Yes.
And you as an anthropologist are someone who gets to watch it. I think the difference between the mental health care system and the criminal system is the criminal system, somebody can have a iPhone and record how structural racism negatively impacts people. In the mental health system, this happens behind closed doors in treatment rooms. So there's nobody recording it. So it doesn't become viral and it's not part of the national consciousness in the same way. But the medical system, the mental health care system, absolutely harms people, absolutely takes lives, absolutely does negative things. We just can't capture it in the same way. And that's why I love what your work is doing, because it's exposing that system where the racism is just as bad. It's just, you know, behind the do not disturb sign on the clinic wall.
And often like more palatable. Like it's super more palatable what's happening to that kiddo in you know, the clinic as the ADOS is being run, right? Like that it can just look like a clinician trying to make a friendly gesture or understand this kid, when actually, you know, we watch what's happening and it has real repercussions, you know. Yeah, this is a tough question.
A great topic. Before we move to some of the audience questions, Rita, did you have anything you wanted to share?
Stephanie, one thing that you kind of opened with that really resonated with me was like, I took note of it. Like one of the students was like, what happens if you run into culture? Right. And that was amazing. Like if you run into this like thing that we want to isolate and put away as we're trying to work with these kids, what would you do? Right. And then the question is not what to, like, it's a really tough thing. Like it's not what you do when you see this culture and how you move it away, but how can clinicians be trained in a way that embraces culture, even if these standardized assessments have these very strict norms that are norm-based on like Euro-Western ideals, right? And that's, I feel like, is the really tough question here.
I think if you could start by just simply like demanding that clinicians understand that everything's culture, right?
Yeah.
Like a response culturally informed. There is no view from nowhere, right? Like you are clearly, my view, your view, as you explained in your talk, is very particular to the way that you were brought up in this world and experienced your space, right? So I think that alone would do a lot of good work, is if we could really think about the fact that there is no view from nowhere. There's no running into culture unless you have like an unmarked spot where something normative exists that you're not naming, right? Right. Because you're looking for another immediately, and you've now said culture is the other. So I thought like, God, he just taught that to a room of 50 people. We're in trouble. Like, yeah, we're in big trouble.
Yeah.
This is so great. I feel like I could listen to the three of you talk for a very long time. There was a question that came in that Stephanie, you answered. Thank you so much in the Q&A, but you'll be welcome to expand upon your answer if you'd like. But I really wanted to make sure Sarah and Rita had a chance also to weigh in. I think it's so important that we have, you know, voices of the autistic actually speaking. And they would like to know how, if you can talk a little bit about how you center Black autistic voices, especially Black autistic adults, instead of just the parents of the kids. And before you answer, I did want to point out that on the very first day of the summit, there was a session that actually did this somewhat. So if people are looking for that, they can go back and find those recordings. And it was a really powerful session. So, but then I'd love to hear from you all. What can we do? How can we do this better to really center on those voices?
I truly like what Sarah said when she said forgetting about the letters after someone's name, right? Forgetting that we're an expert in something, but really, I feel like the more someone learns, the more we figure out that we really don't know much, right? And so just really realizing and saying it's okay. I don't know, right? I don't know what it's like to be autistic. I don't know what it's like to be growing up in the US as a Black white woman. I just know what it's like to grow up in an urban little environment in Lebanon, right? But just listening to other people is the only way that we can grow and learn. I think it's hard to say, I don't know. I think people have to be comfortable to say it.
And that gets to the culture of medicine and mental health, right? Like at the end of a session, we're supposed to come up with a diagnosis. And we actually won't get paid if we don't come up with a diagnosis, because we have to put something down on the billing sheet to bill, right? And so it promotes this, you know what's going on after 2 or 3 hours, which doesn't fit with like how complex people and societies and families are. And so I think that's one of those things that we have to go against the culture of medicine in order to center the voices of the people we're saying that we're serving, which is unfortunate and problematic and counterintuitive that that's the case, but it does require a shift in how we operate.
Stephanie, did you have anything else you wanted to add to what you said? I thought what you said in the Q&A window was great, and I can just direct people to read that if you'd like.
Yeah, just that, I do absolutely think that Black autistic voices need to be centered, and that's why I'm careful not to speak for Black autistic people, because I think that I absolutely loathe when white people speak for me as a Black woman. And I understand that this may not be a satisfying answer, and there definitely may be holes in what I'm saying. But just that we have to like make space, and the ways that we can make space are, demanding that we change the ways in which education is working. Black autistic people need to have space to do their PhD in a way that's reasonable and gain access to these platforms as much as possible. I think that that's some of the things that we can do to do some structural work to make changes, right? Making sure that my classroom for undergraduates is as accessible as possible, and making sure that students have space to learn who are neurodivergent, right? And participate. And so I just personally have been very hesitant to like speak for Black autistic people. It makes me nervous given how I feel about how people talk about Black people in general. So,
and I think we really answered the next question pretty well through what you just said, but I just want to make sure that we didn't miss any part of it, was just whether you think autistic adults should be speaking about their own neurology, and when our platform is going to be given to them. And maybe if you know of any platforms, if you could share those. I saw you nodding your head that yes, they should be speaking.
Yeah, they should. I mean, like, they should be on this panel. They should be on every panel. But it's just so unsatisfactory that we're saying that and haven't done it, right? And I think we need to like be really open in acknowledging that. And absolutely, that's the thing. Like, autistic people of color should have their own space to speak. That's yes, without question, yes.
And being part of the research process, right, as well. A more participatory model.
Right, in the research, yeah, excellent.
I'm not sure.
Sarah, did you have anything else before I move on to the next question? Okay, so we have a question about optimism bias. And if you find that optimism bias on the part of the clinician or the part of the parent or the person being diagnosed actually impacts the diagnosis or contributes to diagnostic disparities? And if it does, how can a clinician overcome that? I think, Sarah, you had optimism bias in your presentation.
I didn't have optimism bias, but I think I can try to respond. So optimism implies that one is better than the other, right? So you're introducing some hierarchy there. right? So rather than seeing this as neurodiverse or different, we're seeing this as deficient, right? And so I think it starts with not framing this as a deficiency, which is hard when we talk about disorder and illness and disability, and those are the words that we lead with. And so there's a piece of this that is around framing and around helping people understand this really isn't about the label. This is about understanding your child, what works for them, and helping them get the most they can out of the educational process, the training process, what have you. And so this is a conversation that I have in clinic a lot around, you know, what does it mean to you for your child to have a diagnosis? What does it mean to you for your child to be on medication? Because sometimes there is this feeling that I've done something wrong, or it means they'll never be able to grow up and do X, Y, Z. And so I think you have to sort of head off optimism bias with reframing diversity neurologically, because anytime you start putting things in a hierarchy, people aren't going to want to be on the lower one, especially when you're talking about people of color who are already othered or marginalized, who get messages from the broader society and even from their own family. You can't afford to mess up because you're already Black, essentially. And so there's a fear that can elicit of having another mark against you because of the realities of what you're up against in society.
Stephanie or Rita, do you have anything else on that one? We have other questions, so we'd love you to weigh in if you do, but don't feel pressured to if you don't.
That was great.
Yeah, it's great. So we had a question about teachers and school districts, which is actually related to one of my questions. So I'm very excited to ask you this question, which is, how do we help teachers in school districts broaden their thinking about the behaviors they see? What structural changes should we advocate for in our own school districts?
Wow, that's a tough question. So many thoughts. I can see Stephanie's reaction too. She's like, where do I start? If we're thinking about just autistic individuals in general, or when multiple different identities come into play, that's when it gets harder. I mean, when we were talking about this, I was just thinking about one of my experiences. So a few years ago, I was part of a summer transition program for teenage autistic students, and the PI was Kristen Glaspielan, who's in this talk. And one of my roles was giving a talk about autism, right? And all of the people who are in the program were autistic students going into college. And I felt so uncomfortable because I was telling people who are autistic what autism was, right? But at the same time, what made me feel so uncomfortable, and Sarah, you kind of talked about that, is calling autism a disorder. And like, I felt really uncomfortable. And just thinking about that, I feel like there should be a shift in perspective in general in the schools, among mental health professionals, just towards a more accepting kind of view of our own limitations as professionals as well, right? As we're thinking about people who are diverse, whatever we want to put under that diversity umbrella. So just thinking about that, just reflecting on how our perceptions, what we go around thinking is right, how might not really be right. Yeah, but what we have to do is think about what that person needs and accommodate them, as opposed to putting people in different boxes and labels.
Stephanie, I know it's a big question.
Yeah, it's a big one. So I think one of the things, again, that we have to do, it's not just, you can't just keep putting Band-Aids on this. It's not just more resources, more resources, more resources. We have to come like deeply into contact with the fact that ableism is like a pillar of white supremacy. It is one of the things that holds racism in place, right? And so if you want to do that work in schools, you're really going to have to do the deep work that requires you to think about ableism and how you take people and just dismantle them, right? And couch disability as less than when it's not, you know, and it's just really hard work, and it's not necessarily about just getting funds or resources in place, although I think a lot of that can be helpful. Can we talk about some inclusion models? Can we talk about teacher supports? Can we talk about smaller classrooms, things like that, right? But for sure, those are necessary, but also this is deep societal work. This is not just the teachers or the clinicians. This is a societal project.
Where's the reset button on society? Factory reset.
Sarah, did you have anything you wanted to weigh in? Just what can we do as looking at our own schools and our own school districts to help improve the disparities that we're seeing, the inequities that we're seeing, not just disparities, but inequities?
Yeah, and some places have tried, right, to cap per pupil spending so you don't have such wild inequities on the amount of money that's spent on one kid at one school versus another. That may be hard to do, but there are things you can do, like count. Are you suspending, expelling Black and brown kids more than you're suspending, expelling other kids? And if so, why? And what can you do about it and do something about it? So like, there are things that are really simple that can be done, but there's a way that it's sort of, again, that disparity thing, it's accepted as, you know, Black and brown kids get expelled and suspended more. Oh, that's a shame. Whereas if we think about it as an inequity, like, okay, so let's address it, and let's try to address it, and then let's recount it and see if it got better. And if it didn't, then we need to like do something else to address it.
I think you're raising a great point that has come up in some of our other panels too, which is about data. You know, ground a lot of these in data and measure it. And, you know, we measure what we care about, or it says a lot about what we care about, what we're measuring and what we're doing with our data and how we're making it action oriented. So I feel inspired. I could do that. So thank you.
I'm a little nervous on this data topic, right?
It is. It's a tricky thing, right? There's a lot about data I agree. I'd love to hear what you have to say because it makes me nervous too.
We have 400 years of data. You have enough. You know what you need to do.
I love that. That's true too. Yeah. Stay unmuted. So we're getting close to the end. I feel like we have I have at least one more great question. A couple great questions about humility. A lot of questions have come in like in the last 3 minutes while I've been so engrossed in what you're saying. So apologies about that. But people would love to know more about how you can change the diagnosis process so that there is cultural humility regarding neurodiverse culture, while also providing the needed diagnosis so that they can get the supports. So how do you balance that?
So this is also very much related to listening to people and their experiences and not just coming in as, well, yes, as a professional, you might know what the different interventions are, but you also need to listen to the person and also have that humility too, to understand what the needs are. Because again, knowing one autistic person, right? People say that all the time, is just knowing one autistic person and their accommodations might be different. So listening to people and listening to what their struggles are can really open the floor to even better accommodations and even better services.
I think for diagnosticians, helping them understand that that's part of the treatment process, right? So I supervise trainees, and we had a kid in clinic a couple of weeks ago, and she was like, I'm not really sure what's going on. I don't know what to do. I feel like I didn't do anything today. And I said, you listened to his mom for 80 minutes. You established rapport. You built a foundation so that when you do say something, she actually trusts what you said. That's really important, right? And so there are ways that we have to understand that. And I think that most people go into mental health because they want to help people. It's something I talk to my trainees about all the time. Is the best treatment plan is the one that the patient is able and willing to follow. You're only going to understand what that is if you've taken the time to really get to know and understand them. So not having the answer, not having the treatment plan, not having it perfectly tied up in a bow, not seeing that as a failure, but understanding that process of humility and listening is a key part of the diagnostic and the treatment process.
Well, and kind of building on that, there was a question for Rita about speaking about the Muslim community and in regards to helping for them. And like the example given is like, what if someone doesn't want to take medication during Ramadan? So it's like kind of, yeah. So commenting on that as a different area of diversity.
So I've actually experienced something very similar in a different life a long time ago. I was an intern at a hospital in Lebanon as like a psych major. And so one of the clients there did not really want to take medication because it was during Ramadan and they did not want to fast. But I feel like this is where understanding culture and letting patients really or clients express themselves is important, but also maybe reflecting on what they know about their religion and how sometimes written in certain religions is like, well, when something is really harming you, right? Like what if you need to take a certain diabetes medication or something that really affects your life or is kind of life or death situation? How can you help clients kind of make sense of that? And I've had a lot of friends who can like really reflect on that, where they're like, oh yeah, we've had a family member who fell because they didn't take a certain medication because they were fasting. So there is this balance between humility and kind of talking to the patient and trying to relate to, well, during fasting, what can you do and what you cannot do. I do have a lot of friends who are Muslim, and during fasting, for instance, when women have their periods, they don't fast, right? So there are all these rules within different religions that might account for or do account for why people need medications. So I hope that answered the question a little bit.
I think so. I think it's a separate topic we could probably spend hours on as well, because learning about being culturally humble is having that humility. There's so much to learn about so many cultures, and we can never stop learning. So I think that's where I want to end, is just to ask, because someone asks if there are any sources that you recommend to learn about how to be more culturally humble and working with neurodiverse folks and their families. So we'll close with that, and any other parting words you want to say. If you have a resource you might throw out to help people continue on their journey with culture humility, or any parting statement you want, I'll let you decide how you want to use your last minute here.
Sarah, I don't know if you have any sources. I'm going to just add a source that I found pretty helpful for me that I've cited throughout the talk, which is one of the Fisherborn articles. Where can I put this?
You can answer it over in the Q&A if you, it's towards the very bottom. Sarah?
And something I'd encourage people to do is just to learn about their local community. So, is your community impacted by redlining? Are the schools, the kids you serve, attending 99% free lunch? Like, there are things that are publicly available that give you a picture of some of the, you can crime map neighborhoods and see what's going on in communities. So there's a lot of publicly accessible, easily available information on a structural level that you should be curious about and finding out about if you're serving people.
So yeah, so the reason why I like that article is because it has a lot of questions that can get you thinking when you go into the community and you work with people, some questions that get you to reflect on how your views can impact, or even how different organizations that we might work for or work at might value diversity or might not value diversity, right? So just kind of reflecting when you are in the community.
Awesome. Stephanie, you get the last word. You had the first word, you get the last word.
That's frightening. Okay, so really, I would say, you know, these resources are great, but this is like real deep, again, self-work as well, right? Like you just have to decide that the human next to you is experiencing this place on this planet differently than me. And I don't need to know their story or anything about the structures to believe that they too have a right to safety and a right to health care and a right to live their life in ways that are salient to them, right? Like, I think it's a real dangerous slide to think that we have to know the other to be able to provide care and love and support in a way, right? I think you can really just decide that I love human beings enough to be a part of this project, right? And allow them to be happy and loved in space, right? Like, you know.
Yeah,
but
I think it's not about knowing the other, but rather knowing our own limitations and knowing the way we see the world is through our own lens.
Well, I have chills just listening to you all talk. You've been such an inspiration, and I can't thank you enough for taking the time to be with us and share your experience and your expertise. And I would love to keep talking to you, but sadly the other session has to start. But great for them, sad for me. Great for me too, because I'll probably listen to it and get a lot out of it, as I've gotten a lot out of every session at the summit. But thank you all so much. And we are running back to back with the other session, which is going to start right away. And I am going to pass the mic to Janet Miller. And I am going to butcher this. I'm so sorry. Quinn Nguyen.
That was perfect.
Thank you, Callie.
Thank
Great.
you to our panelists. It was wonderful.
Yeah, great panel. Thank you all. So we are going to transition right into our next session, and I'll just say welcome to the Stanford Neurodiversity Summit. Some of you may have already participated along the way, but for those of you who have just joined, welcome to the summit. We'd like to let you know that all sessions are being recorded and will be transcribed, and please do check our summit website for YouTube videos. Also, all questions from the audience will be submitted through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and the moderators will try to cover as many questions as possible. So this session is on mental wellness in the workplace and beyond, part 2. So part 1 was Sunday afternoon. And I'm Janet Miller, one of the co-moderators. I'm a clinical psychologist in the Stanford Adult Neurodevelopment Clinic and a clinical associate professor here. And my co-moderator, Dr. Quinn Nguyen, is a psychiatrist also in the Adult Neurodevelopment Clinic and a clinical instructor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences. So I want to make sure all the panelists are visible. Great. So I am very pleased to introduce our first speaker, Greg Yates. Greg is co-founder and co-chair of Ascend, which is a wonderful San Francisco-based nonprofit devoted to serving the needs of adults on the autism spectrum. He is also founder of the Otsit Meditation Retreat for autistic adults, as well as a longtime meditator himself. And he is here today to talk about meditative practice in autism. So welcome, Greg. We're so happy to have you.
Hello, it's good to be here. Let's see if I can make this work. All right. Okay. Can you see my screen, my screen? Hello?
I can see you. I don't see your screen, though.
All right, hold on. Share screen. Here we go. Share. Let's try again.
There. Great. That's perfect.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you. All right. So I'm going to be talking about meditative practice in autism. I am autistic, and so what I'm talking about is something I do and use myself. I apologize, I don't have any captions for technical reasons. And if you have questions, please be sure to send them out during the talk. I hope there's time immediately at the end of the talk to answer some of those. I'm going to start with, here we go, come on. Oops, here we go. First, I want to say a little something about autism. I say autism is prominently a social condition. The term was used 3 times